Once the largest corporation on Earth, the Pennsylvania Railroad didn't just collapse, it vanished. This is the story of how the mightiest railroad empire in history rose, dominated, and was erased. On May 22, 1846, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania granted a charter to a new corporation with a single, audacious goal: forge a direct rail link between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The challenge was not just distance, it was the Appalachian Mountains, a wall of stone that had frustrated engineers and merchants for generations. Early surveys flagged the Alleghenies as a nearly insurmountable obstacle, yet the Pennsylvania Railroad's founders were determined. They assembled capital from private investors and state bonds, then set to work with a workforce drawn from immigrant camps scattered along the planned route. Timber shanties, muddy grading camps, and the constant clang of pickaxes became the soundtrack of a project that would soon define American ambition. The breakthrough came in the form of the Horseshoe Curve. Completed in 1854, this 2,375-foot sweep of rail bent the mountains to the railroad's will, allowing trains to climb the steep grades with a gentle, continuous arc. It was a marvel of mid-19th century engineering, designed to avoid costly tunnels and treacherous inclines. The curve cut travel time between east and west by nearly half, turning a grueling journey into a single, uninterrupted run. Freight and passengers now flowed across Pennsylvania with a speed and reliability that reshaped the state's economy. The Pennsylvania Railroad's own annual reports from the 1850s show a surge in tonnage and revenue, proof that the investment in engineering paid off. Behind the scenes, a new kind of management was taking root. J. Edgar Thomson, a civil engineer by training and a relentless organizer by temperament, joined the enterprise first as chief engineer, and then, in 1852, as president. Thomson looked beyond tracks and locomotives. He saw the need for discipline and uniformity. He created a centralized engineering department in Philadelphia, staffed with graduates from the University of Pennsylvania's new civil engineering program. This department became the nerve center for the entire railroad, issuing blueprints, overseeing construction, and enforcing standards across hundreds of miles of track. Thomson's most lasting innovation was the introduction of a single, uniform rulebook, a first for any American railroad. Whether the earliest comprehensive edition appeared in 1859 or 1865, what mattered was the principle. Every train, every crew, every division operated by the same set of rules. The rule book codified everything from brake systems to hand signals, and it was printed and distributed to every locomotive cab. The result was a dramatic drop in accidents and delays, and a workforce that could be shifted anywhere along the line with no loss of efficiency. The Altoona shops, the railroad's industrial heart, began turning out standardized locomotives and freight cars, each built to common specifications. This was not just a railroad, it was a machine for moving goods, people, and capital with ruthless efficiency. Thomson also imposed new accounting practices, introducing systematic cost tracking and depreciation schedules for rolling stock. Investors found comfort in the company's transparent ledgers, and foreign capital followed. By the end of Thomson's tenure, the Pennsylvania Railroad was more than a transportation company. It was a template for the modern American corporation, built on the twin pillars of technical mastery and managerial control. The groundwork was laid for the Pennsylvania Railroad to become the self-proclaimed standard railroad of the world, and for its empire to stretch far beyond the mountains it had once struggled to cross. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad stood unrivaled. Its red Keystone logo was stamped on everything from steel bridges to company stock certificates, a symbol of might recognized from Wall Street to the English Parliament. The numbers alone told a story few could match. In 1915, The PRR's gross operating revenue soared to $374.9 million, outpacing the combined earnings of America's largest steel and banking giants. The New York Times splashed the headline across its front page, making it clear that the railroad was not just a company, but a national force. This was more than a network of rails. The PRR's empire stretched nearly 9,000 miles, its tracks forming the steel backbone of the eastern United States. Its reach extended from the coal fields of Pennsylvania to the bustling docks of New York and the factories of the Midwest. Each day, freight trains pulled by PRR locomotives hauled more than 40 million tons of anthracite coal, enough to heat every home and power every mill from Philadelphia to Chicago. That was nearly half of the nation's coal shipments, a figure that left competitors scrambling for the scraps. Steel and oil were no less tightly gripped. The PRR's own Braddock Steel Works turned out 12 million tons a year, feeding the insatiable appetite of American industry. Petroleum flowed east from the Standard Oil pipelines, with 8 million tons a year shipped on PRR rails. These numbers translated into real power. The railroad could dictate rates, control supply, and in effect, set the terms for entire sectors of the economy. Altoona, Pennsylvania, became the industrial heart of this machine. The Altoona shops, a city within a city, produced more than 15% of all locomotives in the United States during World War I. The shops ran around the clock, their forges glowing night and day, their output a steady stream of standardized engines and rolling stock. Towns like Altoona and Braddock lived and died by the PRR payroll, municipal budgets, schools, and even local politics bent to the railroad's will. The company's influence ran deep into the corridors of power. PRR executives were regulars at White House receptions. Political heavyweights Carnegie, Morgan, the Mellons held large blocks of stock and sat on the board. Lobbyists pressed Congress for favorable tariffs and fought off regulatory threats. In the Gilded Age, the PRR was not just a business, but a kingmaker. Its legal team appeared before the Interstate Commerce Commission so often that the PRR's view of fair rates became the de facto policy for the Eastern railroads. But with such dominance came enemies. The railroad's size and efficiency bred resentment among rivals and suspicion among regulators. The slogan, "The Standard Railroad of the World," was more than marketing. It was a statement of fact, and also a challenge. In setting the standard, the PRR also set itself up as the target for every would-be reformer and competitor. The seeds of later trouble were already being sown, even as the empire seemed unassailable. For now, though, the Pennsylvania Railroad moved America and called the tune for anyone who wanted to keep up. Rivalry between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central was more than a contest for passengers and freight. It was a corporate rivalry, fought with every weapon available, fair cuts, legal maneuvers, and at times outright sabotage. In 1867, the Pennsylvania Railroad slashed the New York to Chicago fare to just $2, undercutting the Central and launching a price war that sent shockwaves through the industry. Newspapers reported lines of travelers snaking through stations, eager to take advantage of fares that barely covered the cost of coal. The New York Central struck back, matching the prices and flooding the market with discount tickets. Profits vanished. What began as a battle for market share quickly became a campaign of attrition, draining both companies' coffers. The war did not stop at the ticket window. In the 1880s, accusations of sabotage and obstruction spilled into the courts. In 1888, the Pennsylvania Railroad filed suit over alleged blockades on the Pittsburgh to Philadelphia line, claiming New York Central crews had dumped debris on single-track sections to delay rival trains. Both sides hired private security and armed watchmen, turning the right-of-way into a no-man's land patrolled by railroad detectives. Every mile of track became a front in an undeclared war, with crews racing to lay new rails, secure key junctions, and outmaneuver the competition at every turn. These clashes forced both railroads to overbuild, constructing redundant lines, massive terminals, and sprawling yards that would burden their balance sheets for decades. The cost of victory was measured not in miles gained, but in soaring fixed expenses and mounting debt. The Pennsylvania Railroad's engineering department churned out blueprints for new cutoffs and bypasses, while the Central poured money into parallel routes. The result was a landscape littered with excess capacity and a financial structure that would haunt both empires long after the guns of the Railroad War fell silent. The only real winners were the shippers, who enjoyed low rates while the two giants bled each other dry. Steel arches rose from the heart of Manhattan, crowned by a colonnade of white granite and a waiting room modeled after the baths of Caracalla. In 1910, the Pennsylvania Railroad unveiled its ultimate monument, Pennsylvania Station. Designed by McKim, Meade, and White, the station was conceived as both a gateway and a declaration, a statement that the PRR was not just the standard railroad of the world, but the master builder of civic grandeur. The numbers alone defied belief. The train shed spanned 1 million square feet, sheltering 21 tracks beneath a cathedral of glass and steel. At street level, twin rows of massive Corinthian columns marched down 7th Avenue, each block of granite quarried and set to echo the great monuments of Rome. The main concourse soared 150 feet overhead, sunlight flooding through arched windows and dancing across mosaic maps of the American heartland. Marble staircases swept travelers up from the city's depths, while bronze eagles watched over the crowds below. The station's opening drew a crush of 100,000 passengers in its first month. Reporters called it a gateway to the continent, a place where the nation's ambitions converged. The New York Times praised it as a cathedral for the machine age, a public space on a scale few Americans had ever seen. Concerts and exhibitions filled the halls, and during World War I, the waiting room became a rallying point for soldiers shipping off to Europe. For the Pennsylvania Railroad, Penn Station was the crown jewel, the physical embodiment of a railroad that had conquered mountains, outbuilt its rivals, and now claimed the very center of the nation's greatest city. The Keystone logo, carved in limestone above the main entrance, left no doubt about who ruled the rails. In the years that followed, the station's grandeur would become inseparable from the railroad's identity, a symbol of corporate power, civic pride, and the belief that the future belonged to those who built big and built to last. By the mid-20th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad faced a world it could no longer command. The post-war boom brought millions of new automobiles onto American roads, each one a rolling vote against the old order of steel rails. In 1949, PRR trains still carried 20 billion passenger miles, a number that had seemed untouchable. But by 1960, that figure had plunged to just 9 billion. The highways were pulling travelers away, mile by mile. As families traded the regimentation of the timetable for the freedom of the open road, the blow landed hardest with the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Congress authorized 41,000 miles of new interstate highways, a concrete web that would soon parallel and undercut the PRR's most lucrative corridors. Trucking firms, once minor players, now siphoned away the bread and butter of the railroad's freight business. By 1965, trucks were hauling nearly a third of the nation's bulk commodities. Coal, steel, and oil, once the lifeblood of the PRR, now rolled on rubber tires, bypassing the railroad's once unchallenged domain. But the real squeeze came from Washington. The Interstate Commerce Commission, created in the Gilded Age to rein in railroad excess, now boxed in the PRR at every turn. The company could not raise fares or cut unprofitable routes without months of bureaucratic wrangling. Wartime price controls, imposed during World War II and the Korean conflict, lingered long after the shooting stopped, freezing rates, even as costs climbed. The PRR's own annual reports from the late 1950s are filled with warnings. The company's hands were tied, its ability to compete shrinking with each passing year. The result was a business model trapped in the past. The PRR's sprawling infrastructure, built for a world of limitless growth, became a liability in an era of declining traffic and fixed prices. Every mile of redundant track, every underused terminal weighed down the balance sheet. The railroad that had once dictated terms to shippers and politicians now found itself hemmed in on all sides, unable to adapt, unable to escape. The empire that had set the standard for efficiency was being outflanked by speed, flexibility, and a new vision of American mobility. On October 16, 1963, the city signed away its most storied gateway. Demolition crews from F.J. Miller and Company arrived at Pennsylvania Station with a contract worth $2.6 million and a mandate to clear the ground for Madison Square Garden. The first blows fell on the marble colonnade, sending clouds of dust swirling over 7th Avenue. For weeks, jackhammers and wrecking balls chipped away at the Beaux-Arts grandeur that had once greeted a continent's ambition. Columns toppled, mosaic maps shattered underfoot. By January, only skeletal steel beams remained, silhouetted against the winter sky, like the bones of a lost civilization. The public response was immediate and anguished. On October 23rd, nearly 5,000 people gathered outside the station's battered facade, holding signs that read, "Save our station, and architecture is not a commodity." Jane Jacobs, already a fierce critic of urban renewal, stood at the front lines and said, "We are losing a treasure we cannot replace." Architects, students, and ordinary New Yorkers joined in, their chants echoing through the vast, hollowed-out concourse. Police counted the crowd as it surged and ebbed, a tide of protest that would not be ignored. Editorials in the New York Times captured the city's sense of loss. A headline asked whether the city had become a place without memory, and letters poured in from across the country, some from travelers who remembered the sunlight flooding the concourse, others from residents who saw the demolition as an act of civic vandalism. The station's destruction became a rallying point for a new kind of activism. Over the next year, architects marched from Grand Central to the ruins of Penn Station. Preservationists packed city council hearings demanding protection for what was left of New York's architectural heritage. From this outcry, a movement took shape. In June 1964, the city established the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Less than a year later, on April 28, 1965, the City Council passed the Landmarks Law, giving the Commission real power to protect historic sites. The loss of Penn Station had become more than a local tragedy. It was a warning shot that changed national attitudes about preservation. The demolition left a scar, but it also galvanized a generation. In the words of one protester, "We were fighting for memory, not just bricks." On February 1, 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad and its old adversary, the New York Central, signed away their independence and created Penn Central. The deal was billed as a merger that would erase decades of redundant tracks, close, costly terminals, and save a projected $120 million a year. Wall Street cheered, and the executives promised a new era of efficiency. But beneath the headlines, the two giants brought together not just their assets, but their flaws, and the cracks began to show almost immediately. The trouble started deep in the ledgers. The Pennsylvania Railroad's cost center accounting, honed over a century to track every dollar of steel and coal, collided headlong with the New York Central's segment reporting system. Expenses were counted twice, overhead ballooned, and auditors struggled to untangle the numbers. Day-to-day operations slowed as managers waited for reconciliations that sometimes took days. Former Penn Central accountant John Keller later recalled that they would spend half the month just figuring out what they had already spent. Debt mounted at a staggering pace. The combined company entered the merger with $1.8 billion in long-term obligations. By the end of 1969, that number had swelled to $2.3 billion, much of it tied up in high-yield bonds meant to fund upgrades that never arrived. The new entity's operating ratio, once a point of pride, soared past 90%. Every dollar earned was devoured by expenses and interest. In January 1970, Penn Central defaulted on a $200 million bond issue. By June 1970, the company was in bankruptcy court, unable to meet payroll or basic maintenance. The collapse of Penn Central was more than a business failure. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history, a financial implosion that sent shockwaves through banks, pension funds, and the federal government. The rescue that was supposed to save the railroad had instead accelerated its downfall, exposing the dangers of incompatible systems, unchecked borrowing, and the illusion that sheer size could overcome structural decay. The standard railroad of the world had not just stumbled, it had imploded, leaving behind a tangle of debts and a warning to every institution that believed itself too big to fail. Today, the tracks that once bound an empire have mostly vanished, but the lesson endures. No institution, no matter how vast, is immune to disruption or decline. As technology and priorities shift faster than ever, the fate of the so-called standard railroad of the world is a stark warning. Adapt or be erased. What echoes is not just steel and steam, it is the cost of ignoring change. Share your thoughts below.